In our previous episode, we explored the rise of James Douglas, from a noble outcast and on the fringes of medieval society to leading war veteran and Scottish icon. Now we continue his tale after the Scots' decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn and Edward II's retreat back towards England. The north of England was now vulnerable to raids, which James organised so incredibly effectively that by the time King Edward could respond, the Scots were back over the border into Scotland. The war was at a complete stalemate. The raids into northern England only temporarily subsided as a poor harvest stopped both sides in their tracks, as a famine occurred in 1316 that was so severe that in one case King Edward could not even find bread on a trip to York. As for James, he still looted and attacked where he could, and in one skirmish, James single-handedly killed several English lords in one-on-one combat. With such a reputation, James was granted titles and lands from King Robert, as Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, was killed in 1318 at the Battle of Forhart. James was also granted the position of Guardian of the Realm following Edward's death. In 1319, James was one of the commanders along with Thomas Randolph in a diversionary raid in the north of England, as the town of Berwick, which the Scots had captured in 1318, was under siege by a large English army of 20,000 men. King Robert had planned to use the raids to draw the English attention away from Berwick. Yet as James and Thomas's raiding party marched closer to the city of York, a rumour began to circulate that the Scots knew of the Queen of England's location in York and sought to capture her. Fearing the Scots could succeed, she fled the city with most of the garrison. With York vulnerable, the Archbishop of York, William Malton, gathered what men he could, which included a large amount of clerics and priests, and sought open battle with the Scots. Yet this battle would be nothing like the Battle of the Standard, as fighting against James's experienced troops, this makeshift army was soon slaughtered, and the army besieging Berwick disbanded and returned to England. A 2-year truce was agreed, giving time for both sides to recuperate, as King Robert sought to reconcile with the Pope. As for James, we hear little of him until the truce ends, at which point he resumes raiding. By August 1322, King Edward had assembled what would be his last campaign into Scotland, but Edward was so slow in organising his army that King Robert, James and Thomas had sacked several more towns, going as far into England as Preston. By the time King Edward reached the Scottish border in August 1322, the English army's provisions were nearly empty. Edward's poor management and lack of foresight always yielded the same results whenever he tried to invade Scotland. The Scots would take anything of value and burn the rest, leaving nothing for the foraging English, and any group of troops that wandered too far from the main army were attacked by James and his raiders. One significant attack occurred at Melrose, as the Scots ambushed a group of English soldiers looting at Melrose Monastery. By September, with his troops starving, Edward returned to England. Another lacklustre campaign further damaged English morale and confidence in the king. As for the Scots, with the English army disbanded, the signal was given for another raid. These raids became a common occurrence for the people of northern England. By October 1322, King Edward would experience his final humiliation by the Scots at the Battle of the Old Byland. The English army led by John of Brittany was so soundly beaten thanks to King Robert's tactic of sending James with an advance party to attack the English uphill, then flank the rest of the English army by climbing up the hillside. Now outflanked, English morale gave way and a mass rout similar to Bannockburn occurred. King Edward, being described by an Italian chronicler as being ever chicken-hearted and luckless in war, now took flight. This defeat was humiliating for Edward, and the raids following the battle would be known as the Great Raid of 1322, no doubt thanks to James and Thomas. In May 1323, a truce was negotiated that gave the Scots the opportunity to extend the length of the truce, as they were in a position of strength to demand such a term. And on the 30th of May, a 13-year truce was agreed by both sides, with guarantees that no new fortifications were to be built along the border, along with wardens on both sides that would maintain the peace. King Edward's reign would soon be at an end, as after sending his son Edward to France to pay homage to the new French king, King Edward's wife Isabella of France orchestrated a plan with her lover and ally Roger Mortimer to oust King Edward and replace him with their son as Edward III, and by 1327 King Edward was forced to capitulate and resign his crown in favour of his son. During the years of the truce, we have little information on James. Perhaps he was busy organising his lands or aiding the government of Scotland, as there were only minor raids during the years of the truce. But with a new regime controlling England, King Robert was eager to make peace, as he was slowly dying from a disease, and knew he needed to leave Scotland in a strong position for his young heir. The peace talks stagnated as soon as they began, as each party was tense, as they both brought an army to the negotiations, but the peace talks quickly broke down and each side began preparations for the upcoming conflict. As King Robert was too ill to lead, he left the command of the army to James and Thomas. Now, the Scots were the ones invading, a complete change from the situation 21 years ago. The Scots now roaming around the north of England, an army under the command of Roger Mortimer and a young 15-year-old King Edward III began a cat-and-mouse game with the Scots around Northumberland. While the English army exhausted itself, the Scots remained elusive. Allegedly, the young king became frustrated and offered a knighthood with an estate to any man that found the Scottish army. Eventually, the English got wind of the Scots' location and began to pursue them, leading them towards the River Wear. Yet heavy rainfall made it impossible to cross. Now, only half a mile separated the two armies, and the English cavalry dismounted and formed 3 divisions before marching towards the river to tempt the Scots to give battle. But as they reached the river, all they could do was stand in the rain, while the Scots remained in their camp. The next day, on the 1st of August 1327, a division of English archers crossed the river with men-at-arms guarding their flanks in the hope of provoking the Scots into a battle. But James recognised this ploy and instead feigned a retreat in order to spring an ambush. But an English squire recognised James and ordered the archers back before they could march into the trap. A stalemate was now in place, as neither side could cross the river in safety, and after 3 days, the Scots moved locations in the night to a more secure location near Stanhope Park, but not before creating the illusion that their former camp was still occupied. On the next night, James led a raiding party that attacked the English camp, and James headed straight for the centre of the camp, where the young King Edward's tent was pitched. The camp was soon screaming the name of Douglas, as James came incredibly close to capturing the young king, as Edward's tent collapsed with him inside, and he was only saved by his chaplain, who sacrificed himself. With the king escaping, James pulled back from the camp and made his way back towards the border. The English, still fearing an attack could come at any time, formed into several divisions and headed south towards Newcastle. When King Edward was told that the Scottish army had headed back to Scotland, he burst into tears over his first campaign failing. By 1328, the English crown was nearly bankrupt, and finally, after 32 years, the First Scottish War of Independence was over with the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton. By 1329, it was clear that King Robert was dying, and he summoned James to grant him his final wish, to take him on a crusade. His heart would be placed in a silver container, which James would wear around his neck. And after King Robert's death, James made his way towards the Iberian Peninsula with a letter of protection and a recommendation from King Edward to Alfonso XI. James would participate in a campaign that would cost him his life, as he died fighting against the Moors, and in one legend he threw the silver container which housed King Robert's heart before he died.